So today we're starting with our seventh lecture in the series, and what I want to talk about this morning is lexical variation as a sociolinguistic variable. So to situate this in the whole structure of the talks, remember that we first had an introduction, and then we went to an analysis of variation within one word, the semasiological approach. Then we've had a few case studies in which we looked at variation in categorization, several categories expressing several meanings. And now we'll turn to what I earlier introduced as formal onomasiological variation, that is, variation in the choice among synonyms. Now, what have we learned so far? If anything, what have we learned? Well, in the first two talks, I tried to make clear that a social perspective is important for cognitive linguistics. That was the bottom line there. In the second set of talks, I made clear, or tried to make clear, that polysemy is subject to lectal variation. And you remember lectal variation is this cover term that I use for all types of social, cultural, and to some extent also historical variation. In the third set of talks, I introduced lectal variation into categorization research. I said, categorization research from the onomasiological perspective. There we said categorization too is subject to lectal variation. But now, in a sense, we're again turning the perspective around, and now we will be saying, yes, but lectal variation as such is meaningful, and specifically lexical variation among forms that, superficially speaking, would seem to express the same thing, would seem to have the same meaning. Even that form of variation is meaningful because it expresses social categories, or because there is a social structure behind that. So that's what we will try to do today. There's another introductory remark that I want to make, because there's something else that we've learned in the previous days, and that is that it's important to methodologically refine what we are doing. If you think what Professor Turner presented in his last talk on Sunday afternoon, what we saw there was that a concept that we tended to take for granted, like conceptual metaphor theory, needed to be refined, and that methodologically you need to go beyond what is given at one point to get at better results. Something similar applies to what I'm presenting here, in the sense that methodological background is important here too. Because now that we will be dealing with lectal variation among near synonymous or synonymous forms, we are moving closer towards the traditional type of methodology that you find in sociolinguistic research. And that's a methodology that is much more quantitative than what is usual in cognitive linguistics. It also means, and you'll see examples of that, it also means that the talks will be getting a bit more technical now. I will be introducing some technical apparatus, some quantitative apparatus that is maybe less common in a cognitive linguistics environment. But I will do my best to introduce it as informally as possible. The most difficult talk in that respect is the one that I will be delivering this afternoon, so you're warned for this afternoon. But this morning is still quite easy. The bibliographical background, you've noticed that I'm referring to some publications for each of the separate lectures. This one, the main source here, unfortunately, is a book that was published in Dutch, so it won't help you a lot. And yeah, coming to the actual topic, what I want to talk about here is what I will identify as a lectometric approach. Now, what is a lectometric approach? Okay, one more piece of terminology. We already know what lects are as this cover term. Now, what is lectometry? Well, that's measuring the relationship among lects. Okay. Suppose you have two dialects of a language, then you can ask yourself the question, how similar are they? And in a very simplistic way, you could say, okay, let's look at the phonology of the two dialects. How much similarity is there in the phonology of the dialects? Well, let's just count the phonemes. That's one thing that people have been doing in what is known as dialectometry, measuring distances between dialects. Now, in the same way in which I introduced the term lect as a cover term for dialects, regiolects, sociolects, and so on, I'm introducing lectometry as a cover term for a quantitative study of the relationship among lects. So we'll be asking questions like, how similar are two varieties of a language? Specifically, that's the general focus in this whole series of lectures. Specifically, I will be looking at that question from a lexical point of view, from the point of view of vocabulary and synonymy. And notice that when you do lectometrical research, when you start measuring the relations between lects, you can access a number of very interesting questions, for instance, questions about standardization. We talked about standardization from, let's say, an ideological point of view last Sunday. What are the models that people use to talk about the relationship between standard languages and dialects? But we also want to have a look at standardization from a descriptive point of view. So we will have to ask questions like, how similar are the different dialects of a language, and how similar are they with regard to the standard language? And the standard language itself, how internally homogeneous is it? Can we measure that? Is it one uniform level, one uniform register or lect, or is there a lot of internal variation? So that's why you can see that when we're interested in these matters, in matters of standardization and variation, that it may be useful to have a measurable form of sociolinguistic studies. So I will try to show how formal onomasiological variation, synonymy, may be used to study the diachronic-synchronic relationship between lects. And I illustrate this methodology by comparing Netherlandic Dutch and Belgian Dutch. We've already had in the third talk, we've already had a brief view of what such a relationship can be. We've already had a brief introduction to the historical background of the relationship between those two national varieties of Dutch, but I will be saying more about that in the course of this talk. So the steps that I will take are the following. First, a bit of theoretical and specifically also methodological background, then case studies, just to show what you can do with this, and then some discussion. Okay. Dialects and standard languages. When you look at it from a descriptive point of view, you can ask yourself, what kind of configurations, what kind of constellations, what kind of structures do we have in the relationship between standard languages and dialects? And there is one German linguist, Peter Auer, who has just 2 or 3 years ago published an interesting model, descriptive model if you wish, of different relationships between dialects and standard languages that you can find in various languages in Europe. So it's a typology, in a sense also a historical typology, of constellations of dialects and standard languages. And what our claims is that if you classify the different relations that you have, you can distinguish between a number of basic types. I'm simplifying a bit, but one type is this, and that's an old type. Okay, what does this mean? Well, on the lower level of the picture, you have the original dialects, the base dialects, the spoken dialects. In the European situation, this would be, for instance, what you find in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, when the standard languages as such do not exist yet. Not the standard languages that we know now. There is no standard French, there is no standard English at that point. But you do have local dialects. On the other hand, you also have a standard language, a written, perhaps spoken standard language, but it's not very directly related. It's not very strictly related to the dialects. Originally, that's not what's in this chart, but originally you would have a situation in which you do have something like a language of culture, which in the European Middle Ages would be Latin, but then Latin would not be related to the dialects. If Latin is the language of culture that you would use in an area where the dialects are, for instance, Dutch dialects, then obviously there is no relation between the standard language and the base dialects. Then at one point in the history of the European languages, people start to use one of the specific dialects as a standard language, but just one of them. And in vertical terms, so the vertical dimension you could think of as a stylistic dimension, as different levels of talking. Yeah? And the highest level would be the level of cultured language, the level of learned texts, maybe also the level of government, specifically those situations where you expect standard languages. So at one point, people pick out one language, put it simplistically, and start using that as a standard language. But there is no continuum. You have the dialects and you have the language, the standard or the cultured language. This is, of course, a situation that in the that in the terminology of sociolinguistics is known as diglossia, a diglossic situation with two fairly well separated strata, levels in the structure of the variation. Then, says Auer, then comes further development in which the continuum that you could have between the base dialects and the standard language is gradually filled up. You get new varieties in the language. So you would have, for instance, base dialects, only spoken language at the very local level, say in your own village or in your own county or whatever. Then you would get regiolects, which would have a somewhat broader scope, a province maybe. Then you would get regional standard languages. And ultimately you would have the standard language that is used all over the territory. So Auer's idea is that in this typology, or in this evolution of standardization in Europe, the possible continuum that you get, or the space that you get in the original situation between the standard language and the base dialects is gradually filled up in the form of more variation, intermediate varieties. Okay? And then, says Auer, then we get a further development, which is what you see in for instance, languages that have a long history of standardization, like Danish or Netherlandic Dutch. What you see there is that the whole structure of variation shrinks. No, sorry, this is the wrong button. Then it shrinks. The dialects disappear. Right? The dialects disappear and everything goes into the direction of the standard language. So that's what in dialectology is also known as dialect loss, the disappearance of dialects. So let's go over this just once more. Oh no, these are the... So here we are. We start with this and we start with a diglossic situation. Then we go to what Auer calls diaglossia with a continuum. And then we get a situation of dialect loss. But now what worries me about this is that if you look at it, closely, then if you take the original situation as it was to the left, and if you take the right-hand situation, the end situation as Auer describes it, there's not a lot of difference between the two. If you just look at these two situations, what is the difference? Well, the only real difference would be the distance that you have between the two varieties. In both cases, you basically have two varieties, two levels, but the only difference between the original situation and the final one would be the amount of not the amount of variation, but the distance between the two, how similar the two are. And you expect them to be more similar in the final situation than in the previous one. So, from a descriptive point of view, we might want to measure that. If it's indeed true, as Auer says, that you get a shift, an evolution from this situation to that situation, well, that means that we will have to measure the distances, that we will have to measure the similarity and the dissimilarity between the different varieties that we find. That's what I'm mentioning here, or what I try to express here. To the left you find this, the same representation that we had a moment ago, this one. On the bottom part of that representation you see that I'm drawing arrows. Drawing arrows meaning, okay, here we are going to compare the elements that we find there. That's traditional dialectometry, measuring the distances between dialects in the traditional sense, local dialects. In the example that I gave, how similar is the phonology between this dialect and that dialect? Just measure the number of phonemes they have in common. Okay? That's what people have been doing traditionally. What I'm suggesting here is that moving from there, we should go to also measuring distances, similarities along the vertical dimension. So that will give us sociolectometry. An important methodological point that we need to spell out now. So now I hope you see that it's interesting to do sociolectometrical research. But how are we going to do it? There's a methodological problem that we face, because you can do it in two ways. And perhaps I should illustrate this again with the graphical representation. This one. So take the right-hand side where you see the red arrows that represent the distances that we're going to measure. Here the question is, yes, okay, but what are the elements among which we are going to measure distances? Okay. And one way of thinking about that would be to say, okay, we know what the language varieties are. We know what the lects are. And we then, and that's, in a sense, that is what is suggested in this figure. Right? You have the ellipses, you have the ovals, and each oval represents a certain lect. And you could say, okay, we know what the lects are, so let's measure the distance between the lects. That is like saying, we know what the dialect of Paris is, and we know what the dialect of Avignon is, and we're going to measure the distance between those dialects. We know what the varieties are. So that's one way of doing it, and in terms of methodological design, you could say that your independent variable here is the linguistic system, and that the dependent variable consists of communicative situations. Why? Well, the real question that you would ask there then is, given this difference between the dialects, or the lects, let me put it more generally, given this difference between lects, where are they being used? Okay. That's what you can imagine, what you can investigate. We know what the lects are, and we're going to see how they are used. That's a way of measuring the distribution of the dialects, the functional distribution. In which situations are they being used? But this way of doing it is only possible when we can already identify what the language varieties are. And that's not necessarily the case. So this way of doing it, starting from, say, a linguistic system as such, and then have a look at the distribution of the linguistic system over functional situations, that's only possible if you can a priori identify which linguistic systems, which lects, which varieties you have. And that may be a difficulty. It's a difficulty because we are not really certain how internally uniform those varieties are. It is the traditional way of doing it. If people think at all about these problems, it's in this way. It's saying, okay, you have the dialect of so-and-so, or you have the standard language, and I'm going to have a look at the situations in which the standard language is being used. But let's suppose now that the standard language as such is not internally homogeneous, that there is a bit of variation within the standard language. Okay, then you have a problem. Then you would have to do this the other way, in another way. That's what I'm suggesting here. If the linguistic system itself is highly variable, then one can study the linguistic relationship between communicative settings. So then we do it the other way around. Then we say what we are going to keep constant is the communicative situation. And then we're going to look what people do in a specific linguistic or communicative situation. In a sense, for each linguistic variable separately. We're not going to have a look at linguistic systems, lects as a whole, but we will look at separate variables and see how the separate variables are distributed over communicative situations. So I could say, if I want to express it in that type of communicative vocabulary, of methodological vocabulary, I could say that the independent variable, what you keep constant, is the communicative situation, and the dependent variable is linguistic usage. And that's the way that I will be doing it, because I don't want to make the assumption that what I've been calling lects so far, I don't want to make the assumption that these lects are really internally homogeneous. I think, well, we will see that very clearly in the very last lecture, in lecture number 10. We will see that lects are certainly not homogeneous internally. Okay? But even now I want to be careful, so I don't want to make the assumption that a linguistic system exists as such. I want to have a look at the separate variables. So because we don't know in advance which linguistic systems, which lects to distinguish, it's the second perspective that we will follow. So that's already two very important methodological points. Why is measuring important? Because we want to see evolutions of standardization and so on. And second, what's the basic perspective for measuring? In this case, I say, okay, let's not assume that there is such a thing as a lect. Let's just assume that we have different linguistic variables, and we will see whether they cluster together as lects or not. Now on to the more quantitative stuff. I'm presenting a case study here in which we look at lexical variation. And we want to look at lexical variation in Dutch from a diachronic perspective. You may remember that I mentioned in lecture 3 that the history of Netherlandic Dutch, Dutch in the Netherlands, and Belgian Dutch, Dutch in Belgium, is different. In Belgium, French used to be the standard language for a very long time, or the language of culture and education for a very long time. Even in those provinces where Dutch is the language of the dialects, okay, of the local language. Only in the course of the 20th century, Dutch became a language of culture and higher education in the northern part of Belgium. And at that point, people adopted the existing standard language from the Netherlands, because in the Netherlands, Standard Dutch had existed since the 17th century. So the history of standardization is much longer, of standardization of Dutch, is much longer in the Netherlands than it is in Belgium. So that raises the question, can we, for Belgian Dutch, can we measure if indeed there is a convergence between Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch? There is this tendency, or there was in the 20th century, this tendency of Belgian Dutch to adopt the existing standard from the Netherlands. But can we see that happening when we describe it? Can we see a convergence between the two? Or is it a process that is not successful? Is there divergence? That's what we want to measure. We're going to do that, obviously, given the overall assumptions of that I talked about in the first lecture. We'll do that in a usage-based approach, and of course with a focus on lexical variation. And then the new thing here is that we'll use a profile-based methodology. And that's what I need to explain now. Yes, well, usage-based, we know about that. Profile-based. What is the notion of profile that I'm introducing here? Well, let's take a set of synonyms, okay, formal onomasiological variation, a set of synonyms naming a certain concept, but then differentiated by their relative frequency. We've already seen an example of that. Remember that we looked at leggings, okay? And we looked at leggings and we said, okay, let's compare the frequency of legging and leggings on the one hand and caleçon on the other hand, the term of French origin. Let's compare the frequencies of those two in Belgian Dutch and in Netherlandic Dutch. Okay? And you may remember that Belgian Dutch started off with the French term and then gradually started to use the English term more, whereas Netherlandic Dutch had the English term all the way down. If you remember that, you will now see that that is actually a process of convergence. Okay? You can see that the Belgian lect, if you wish, moves in the direction of the Netherlandic one. But what is the profile here? Well, the profile, put as simply as possible, is the proportion, in the example, is the proportion between the number of times that you get legging and the number of times that you get caleçon as a name for this concept legging. Okay. So, to put it more simplistically, or no, not more simplistically, more theoretically, it's the set, a profile, as I'm using it here, is the set of synonyms designating a concept differentiated by relative frequency. And as you understand, when we study convergence of divergence processes, it's precisely by looking at changes in those profiles, changes in the relative frequencies of the different forms that express a certain concept. Why would we want to do that? Why would we want to study profiles and not just the individual terms? Couldn't we just do the same thing by saying, okay, but let's just look at the frequency of caleçon. Let's forget about the term legging. Let's just look at the frequency of caleçon. Wouldn't we see the same thing? No, we would not, because there is a methodological danger when you don't look at the relative frequencies, but only at the frequencies of each term separately. The danger is that you get thematic effects. Think about it in the following way. Take a pair of cross-variety synonyms like underground and subway, okay, for American English and British English. Suppose that you have a text and you say, okay, well, let's also suppose that the distinction is not 100%, but let's say that you have a text in which you find a lot of reference to subway. Then you could conclude, oh yes, this is a text coming from America. Yeah, but because it has a high frequency of subway. Yes, but it could also be that it is just a text that is about subways. So the frequency of the term as such could have something to do with the topic, but can also have something to do with the lectal origin, the lectal identification. So if we want to separate those two, the interesting thing will be to say, okay, if we look at all the terms that identify the topic, that name the topic, then the thematic bias, the thematic effect can be neutralized and we can focus on the lectal differences. This we know. So now some examples. We did one, or the basic study that I will be presenting on the diachronic and the synchronic variation, or variation between Belgian Dutch and Atlantic Dutch, basically refers to two semantic fields, two lexical fields: football terms and clothing terms. And we've already seen one example of the clothing terms, legging. But now the football terms, so legging, there you get things like legging, caleçon. The other example here is spijkerbroek and jeans. Well, okay, you know what jeans is, and spijkerbroek is a specifically Dutch term for that. So you get synonyms there, referential synonyms. In football, it's the same thing, and very often, again, you get an alternation between English terms and, let's say, native Dutch terms. Like in the case of goal, you get goal and you get doelpunt. In the case of penalty, you get an alternative term like strafschop. I'm only giving here, most of the cases, most of the examples here are ones with just two alternatives, but you have examples with three alternative names, sometimes even 4 or 5. Notice also that when we have a look at these profiles, these relative proportions among terms like doelpunt and goal, or legging and caleçon and so on, what we basically measure is a form of onomasiological salience. If there is a high frequency of legging in comparison to caleçon, what we can say is that from the formal onomasiological point of view, legging is the most salient term. You will remember that salience plays a crucial role in linking structure and use. Okay, the additional perspective, the importance of French and so on, you realize that is crucial, well, not crucial, or at least important. I've already explained why in one of the earlier talks. For Belgian Dutch, French plays an influence because French used to be the language of culture. English is important because there is this globalization trend, and English has an influence on all languages. So one of the things we might want to know is to what extent do these tendencies, the importance of English, the importance of French, and so on, influence the evolutions that we can see, the developments that we can see. So now on to the real quantitative question. How can we measure the uniformity, the degree of similarity between two sets of usage data, where the usage data are defined in terms of onomasiological profiles? So let me represent this graphically. Let's say that this circle represents one communicative situation. Think of it, for instance, as a newspaper in Holland talking about football, in the kind of example we have here. And talking about football, one specific football concept, like goal. Okay. Or think of it as a fashion magazine talking about clothing, and specifically one type of clothing, leggings. Okay. In that communicative situation, we can then find references to goal or to legging. Let's take the goal example. We can find references to goal, and we could say, okay, we find two terms, A and B. A could be doelpunt, the Dutch term, and B could be goal, the English term. And we can then find, let's say we take a sample of 10 cases. Methodologically, that would not be enough, but let's say we take a sample of 10 cases, and 6 of 10 cases have the variant A, and the other 4 have the variant B. So 6 times A and 4 times B. That's a profile, okay? That's the profile in the term in which I used it, the onomasiological profile of the concept goal in this communicative setting. And then we do the same for another communicative setting that we want to compare it with. Let's say that this is the same thing, a newspaper talking about football, a football report in a newspaper in Belgian Dutch. But there, the profile is different. There we find 3 A's and 7 B's. Not 6 A's and 4 B's, but 3 A's and 7 B's. Okay, now how similar are they? Well, that's in fact, it's very easy, but I'm going through this very slowly. The correspondence between the two is basically just the number of A's and B's that you can connect. Okay, so let's do this step by step. It was Children's Day yesterday. This is a childish representation, okay? So what's the uniformity? Well, the number of common pairs of names and concepts. Here's one A, and here's another A, and here's another A. Oh, and now we're running out of A's that we can connect. The other A's can no longer be connected, so from this point on, they start doing something differently as far as the A's is concerned. Let's do the same for the B's. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now again, we've run out of B's that we can connect. So all the lines together constitute the overlap between the two varieties, between the two samples that we took. So this is what I do the same. But then, of course, if this is the system, then we can translate that into, and this is another way of representing it. It's just the measure of overlap that we have. How many times do they do the same thing? So if you start calculating it, you can say 70% of the naming events is identical in both samples. So over both samples, it's 70% the same. Now, the interesting thing is, when you look at it informally in this way, you can translate that into a formula, because you can say, well, another way of saying this is this. What is the uniformity between two samples Y1 and Y2, the two circles? Well, the uniformity U for a concept Z, the degree of uniformity for the concept goal between the two samples that we took is the sum of the minima of the relative frequencies of one lexical item in the onomasiological profiles for Z in the two samples. There's only one difficult point here. That's why I mentioned the minima. That's interesting. Just to see how... This is only meant for you to get from informal, intuitive representations to formula. Okay? Let's take this one. I said 70% overlap. let me do it here. You will see clearer. How many A's can we connect and how many B's can we connect? Well, there are no more A's that we can connect than the minimum number of A's in the two samples. There are 6 A's there and there are 3 A's here. So the minimum of A's is 3. And we cannot connect more A's than that minimum. Okay? Same with the B's. How many B's do we have? 4 in that case. And, no, wait a minute. So I think I used the wrong number. So it's 3 A's there and 6 A's there, and we can only connect 3 of them. We have 4 B's there and 6 B's here. 7. Yeah? No, 6. And we can only connect 4 of them. So what we can connect is the minimum amount of the A's and the B's. Okay? That's what expressed in this. Say, in this thing, we take the sum of the minima. We get to 70% because we have the 40% of the, or the 4, if you wish, the 4 B's, 40% B's, and 3 A's, 30% A's. So that's sum of minima, relative frequencies, 30%, and so on. And that gives us a degree of uniformity of 70%. Now, the interesting point is that you can also express that in a formula. This is exactly the same thing as what we said a moment ago. But what the advantage of this formulation in a very literal sense, the advantage is that if you have this, then of course you can also put that into a calculating algorithm, and when you have your database, you can do the calculations on the database, because this is something that a calculating machine, so to speak, that a computer could understand. This is not something that a computer understands. This is something that a computer can understand. So when we have this, we can start doing the actual calculations. Okay, let me not dwell on this. Let me introduce a further complication. No, not a complication, a refinement. A further refinement. Let's not try to read this, but let's now try to say, what shall we do when we have a set of concepts? So a moment ago I said, okay, we can now calculate how similar Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch behave with regard to the naming of the concept goal in football. Okay? We can calculate that now, and we can say that newspaper and that newspaper do the same thing to such an extent for such percentages. Okay, but now we have, of course, if we want to say something about the Dutch newspapers and the Belgian newspapers, we don't want to look at the concept goal alone. We would want to have a look at many concepts. Okay? We want to have a look at many concepts in the field of football terminology, in the field of clothing terminology, and ideally speaking, if we would have sufficient time and material to investigate it all, for the entire vocabulary. So we need an extra measurement where we go from one concept to a set of concepts. Now, normally speaking, you would say, okay, but that's easy. You just take the uniformity degree for concept 1 and for concept 2 and for concept 3, and you take the average. Okay? You just add them and you take the average. Yes, but you might want to do it in a slightly more subtle way, because let's say that you talk about clothing terms. And if you talk about clothing terms, we know that some clothing items are fairly basic, like trousers. That's fairly basic. But bowler hats, you know, these round British type hats, those are not very basic. And you don't talk about them a lot. So the thematic or topical frequency of bowler hats is not so very high. So suppose now that you have a look at the frequencies, and you see that bowler hat has only one term, so there is always a correspondence, a uniformity of 100% for bowler hats. At the same time, you have a look at trousers and you see that in the names for trousers there is some variation, and there's only a uniformity of 80% in the naming of trousers. Now, if you take the simple average, you would get a result of 90%, 100% for bowler hats and 80% for trousers. Then you get an average uniformity of 90%. But that's skewing the results, because you would want bowler hat to be less important in the results than trousers, because trousers are so basic, and because we talk about trousers more than we talk about bowler hats. So that's why we use not a simple average, but what we call a weighted average. And that is what is said here. So the uniformity U prime for a set of concepts is the sum of the values, of the uniformity values for the individual concepts, but weighted by the relative frequency of the concepts. So take the total number of times that you talk about bowler hats, and that is maybe 1% of your total sample, of your total material. Take the number of times that you talk about trousers with whatever name, and that's maybe 25% of your total material. So then the uniformity results that you get for trousers will count 25% more, or 25 times more rather, than the results you get for bowler hat, because you have only 1% of relative frequency for bowler hat. Okay? That's the weighted average. Again, we have a formula for that, but that's not so important. And then another thing, I'll have to speed up a bit. Another thing is that we can, that we're in, as I mentioned, we're also interested in the effect of certain item-specific or concept-specific characteristics. So we might want to ask questions like, given the influence of French in Belgian Dutch, the historical influence in the history of Belgian Dutch, can we actually see that the influence of French diminishes or not? Because that's what we expect. We expect a historically important influence of French, and we expect that the influence of French diminishes as time goes by, because there is a standardization in the direction of Dutch. Can we measure that conversely, or in parallel, in the same way? We expect that the influence of English increases, because English, the influence of global English increases everywhere. Can we see that in our materials? Okay. We also expect, and that's a very specific hypothesis, in this standardization process of Belgian Dutch, there was a lot of linguistic policy involved. In schools, for instance, you got to learn lists like, don't say this, that's an old dialect word, but say that. That's the standard word, right? That's explicit linguistic policy, language policy, or language propaganda, if you wish, or education, whatever you would want to name it. So it's interesting to ask yourself the question, are the items that you find on those lists, the items that are either rejected or propagated in the explicit language policies, are those items actually the ones that start moving? Or in other words, does linguistic propaganda, to put it that way, have an effect or not? Okay, and if you compare items that were not part of, let's now say, the school curriculum, and items that were part of the school curriculum, do they behave differently in the process of convergence and divergence? Again, you can transform that into a formula, but I won't elaborate on that. What you do is to, simply put, what you do is this: when you have a profile, like with goal and doelpunt, you can say, okay, goal is an English term, so I know what the proportion is of English terms in this profile. And I can average that over all the profiles that I have. So if I want to measure whether English is on the rise or not, I can take the proportion of English terms in each individual profile that I've calculated and then take the overall result. Then I can see whether English becomes more important or not. That's the way we look at item-specific features. Okay, there are some refinements here, but that's not so important. Again, this is the formula. And yeah, there's another one with a weighted feature, but again, that's not so important. Now, finally, at last, some results. This we already know. We know what to expect, right? There is a late standardization in Dutch. There is an explicit language policy. And there is a special relation to French. So our general expectations are that we will find convergence between Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch, that the normative tradition, what I just mentioned, explicit schooling and so on, will have an effect, and that, yes, that's something I need to explain, and that there will be a negative reaction with regards to French in Belgian Dutch. Because French, in a sense, is what you want to get away from. Okay? So what you expect is that French influence diminishes, and that there might even be a form of purism, what is called linguistic purism with regard to French, that French is explicitly avoided. Now let's see if we can find that. Yeah, this is clear, I think, or this will be clear. So first, the diachronic results. Do we have convergence or divergence? Again, that's what you already know. We'll look at clothing terms and football terms. What is our sample? Where do the terms, or where does the material come from? Well, we looked at journals and magazines at 3 points in time, 1950, 1970, 1990. And so it's about time that we start taking the follow-up, that we start doing the follow-up research. But these are the materials for these 3 points in time. We have a corpus of newspaper text and some additional newspaper text and magazines. There are some additional data, but I will come to that in a moment. Overall, we have a database of 40,000 instances of football terms and clothing terms. So that's quite a lot, and that's certainly sufficient to get some reliable results. And what we find is that we do indeed get convergence on the lexical level between Standard Dutch in Belgium and Standard Dutch in the Netherlands. If we look at this U prime measure, so the weighted average over a number of concepts, we see that it rises with 10% from 1950 to 1990. So these are the results. How can you read this? Well, it's easy, of course. This is Belgium in the 1950s, Belgium in the 1970s, Belgium in the 1990s, the Netherlands, 1950s, 1970s, 1990s. That's the degree of uniformity you have. The U prime measure goes from 70 to 75 to 82. So that's a nice illustration of a converging process. You see that there is indeed, as we expected, a growing uniformity, growing similarity between Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch. Fine. That's the first result. Now we also want to ask ourselves the question, yes, but let's now have a look at the synchronic structure of the two varieties, the 2 national varieties of Dutch. Because what I showed a moment ago was placed on the level of supra-regional national communication. Newspapers that have a national distribution in Belgian Dutch, well, at least in Belgium, or at least the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, because you remember that there is also a French-speaking part. A national distribution, a nationwide distribution, if you wish, and the same for Holland. But what if we look at more local language? What if we go to a stylistically more informal level, for instance? Well, we investigated that too, and we did that for the clothing terms, and we did that in a very specific way, because what we did, we picked out two cities in the Belgian-Dutch region and 2 cities in the Netherlands. And we collected materials in shop windows. So I had students looking at price tags, price labels in shop windows that would say, pair of trousers, so many francs or so many guilders. Now it would be euros, but this is before the euro time. Okay? So that is also a form of collecting material. You notice on the labels whether a thing is called caleçon or legging. Okay? And the interesting thing about that is that it is local material. These are local shops serving a local audience in that specific city. Okay? So if there is more variation on the local level, which is something you more or less expect in this stratificational continuum from our initial presentation, right? If you have a stratificational continuum, we are now sinking in the pyramid. We are sinking one level in the representation we have, and we're going to what you can call, well, more localized language. So the question there is, of course, unfortunately, we can do that only. We could do that only from 1990. It's impossible to do that for 1970 and 1950. Otherwise, it would have been really interesting. But okay, in follow-up studies, we can of course get more material, but it was impossible. So this is just for 1990. And what we find is, and that is again very interesting, but perhaps also to be expected, what we find is an asymmetry in the structure of the 2 national varieties. In what sense? Well, the distance that we can measure between the local materials in Belgium, in Belgian Dutch, and the local materials in Netherlandic Dutch, and then their respective standard languages, let's say the newspaper material, newspaper and magazine material, those distances are different. And the distance is much bigger in Belgian Dutch than it is in Netherlandic Dutch. So the distance between the local and the national language is much greater in Belgium. So the upper part of this figure is the same as what we had a moment ago, but here below we measure the uniformity between Netherlandic Dutch in the 1990s, and I've labeled it think for instance of substandard language, right? Substandard or local language in the Netherlands in 1990. That gives you a relationship of, say, 68%, almost 70%. But in Belgium, in Belgian Dutch, the parallel situation gives you much more. Yes, thank you. The parallel situation is much less uniform. There's only a uniformity of 45% there, not of 68%. And this is, if you think about this in historical terms, then this could be evidence of the late standardization of Dutch in Belgium. I mentioned that the standardization process started 3 centuries later than the standardization process in Netherlandic Dutch. And apparently the standardization process in Netherlandic Dutch has progressed much further than the standardization process in Belgian Dutch. You can see that in the lesser degree, the smaller degree of uniformity between supra-regional language and local language in Belgium than in the Netherlands. Okay. So that's again something that seems to be corresponding to what we could expect, to what we find in our hypothesis. And if we represent that in the graphical representation that we had earlier, and we get something like this. If the right-hand side is Netherlandic Dutch, then we can see that in the presentation by Peter Auer, the representation by Peter Auer in Netherlandic Dutch, the levels are much closer to each other. And in Belgium Dutch, you would have a big difference between standard language and the next level, if you wish. Okay? So we can actually do something with these measurements, and we can give a substantial specification of these abstract representations that we had. For the clothing terms, here you can see, so the blue is Belgium and the red is the Netherlands, and if you take the blue figures, you can see that they diminish. If you take the red one in Holland, there is also some an evolution towards less French, but it's not as uniform as in Belgium. It's not as regular in Belgium. It's going down. In Netherlands, it's much more. Well, there's no clear tendency, or you would say in Holland, but it's an interesting question why, and there are some, in fact, cultural influences there. The influence of French diminishes in the 1970s, but then rises again in Holland. And you could ask yourself why. We can discuss that later. We do have hypotheses about what that is, but specifically because we're interested in Belgian Dutch, you can see that it diminishes there. The influence of English. So our hypothesis is that the influence of English increases both in Belgian Dutch and in Netherlandic Dutch. Well, that's only correct for clothing terms. The thing about football terms is that the influence of English has always been high in football because it's originally an English game, right? So we don't see a lot of change there. But in the clothing terms, we clearly see the impact of globalization. And we actually see it in Belgian Dutch as well as in Netherlandic Dutch. So again, blue is Belgium, red is the Netherlands. And here, the pattern is the same. A moment ago, for French, the pattern is different. For English, the pattern is the same. An enormous rise of French influence in the 1990 English influence in the 1990 material. Again, this is as expected. And again, you can see French is a factor that distinguishes Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch. English influence is a factor that contributes to the similarity. Then, an interesting question. Does linguistic propaganda, explicit normativity have an effect? Well, what we expect is that words that were explicitly disapproved of in dictionaries, in school books and so on, would lose their importance, would lose frequency, would become less frequent. And that conversely, that the words that are propagated, the words where they said, this is what you should say, so the words that have normative backing, if you wish, gain in importance. And again, we find both effects, but the effect is strongest for the negative normativity, for the words that are disapproved. So I'm going to show those to you. Here the colors are a bit different from what we had a moment ago. Here, blue is the clothing terms, and red, those are the football terms. And you can see that in both cases, so in both cases, you get a disappearance of the words that are disapproved of, but it's extremely outspoken in the case of clothing terms, and it's a weaker effect in the case of football terms. It's not really clear to us why that would be the case, why there is such a difference in the effect between the two the two different fields, but the effect is there, okay? You have an effect of the influence of normative traditions. So, finally then, if I have a few more minutes, some discussion. What could you expect is the trend that we see. So we get overall, we get a converging trend towards between Belgian Dutch and Netherlandic Dutch. Is this a stable trend or not? What are the factors that contribute to the further evolution? Well, basically, the further evolution would very simplistically could take three forms. Okay. So this is more or less the situation that you have now. The two standard languages, or the language in the upper registers, are very close to each other. In the more local, supra-regional varieties, there is a bigger difference between, on the Belgian side, than on the Netherlandic side, and the dialects, the really, let's say, the dialects in the villages are very far apart. And the question we are asking is, what's going to happen to this thing? To informal Belgian Dutch? Will it develop in a way in which there is much more similarity between the two, in the structure of the two varieties than is the case now? Will Belgian Dutch evolve, develop in the same way in which Netherlandic Dutch has already developed? In that case, you will get a shift of this variety on the structure in the upward direction. Okay? That's one possible evolution. The other evolution would be in the other direction. Then you would say, okay, the process of convergence will stop. Belgian Dutch will move away from Netherlandic Dutch, and essentially this thing will move downwards, and you will get more internal uniformity in Belgium, but less external uniformity with Holland. That's another scenario that could happen with the Netherlands. And then finally, you could simply assume that the situation is a stable one, for whatever reason. Now, if we look briefly at the questions at the point, what might influence the evolution in one direction or the other, there are two things that we have to see, or that might be somehow fairly concrete factors. It could be that, let me start with that. Global English is something that's putting pressure on both Netherlandic Dutch and Belgian Dutch. So as we've already seen, that could lead either through more loans from English or through a sort of defensive reaction with regard to English, that could lead to more internal uniformity. On the other hand, we can already establish, when we look not at the lexicon but at the pronunciation, that Netherlandic Dutch, the Dutch in the Netherlands, is moving away from Dutch in Belgium. And this is a change that is happening in the Netherlands and not in Belgium. So the lexical convergence that we mentioned is something that happened in Belgium, in Belgian Dutch. The pronunciation changes that you can also measure have something to do with changes that are happening in Holland, in the Netherlands. I'm giving you the figures here of the pronunciation changes, but we need not look at that. So if you look at it from a fairly material, practical point of view, you can say, well, we have evidence at this point, or we see factors, both factors that can contribute to convergence, like the impact of English, which is the same for both languages. But we also have indications that it might go in a diverging direction, because we can also already measure divergence on the level of pronunciation. So from that point of view, we don't know very well. It could go either way. We can't make any predictions. On the other hand, and that's, I think, very interesting from the point of view of what we've been discussing before, it could also be the case that the evolution will be determined by attitudinal factors. So let's try to think, as the very last step now, let's try to think of a way of linking these results about convergence, divergence, and the factors that influence those processes. Let's try to link that to what we said earlier about underlying attitudes with regard to language variation. And here I can refer back to this difference, to this classification I made between rationalist, romantic, nationalist, and postmodern attitudes with regard to language. A purely rationalist attitude in this case would mean, okay, we need maximal communication, so that's why we need continued convergence. If that is what people implicitly or explicitly feel in this language area, in the Dutch language area, then we can expect more convergence if the rationalist attitude is dominant. However, if there is a nationalist feeling, if language in this case is coupled to a nationalist feeling, a nationalist preference for nationalist/romantic preference for expressing a proper identity, then we can expect a growing divergence. A growing divergence of Belgian Dutch with regard to Netherlandic Dutch, because this process of linguistic standardization in the Dutch direction in Belgium is part of the emancipation of Flanders, the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, with regard to French. It's part of identity formation and nation formation, at least historically. So if that is the case, then you would if the language situation is coupled to a certain form of nationalist development, then you can expect a growing divergence. The second scenario. And third, if a postmodern preference for functional differentiation among multiple languages and within one language among multiple registers would be prevalent, then basically it could be the case that we get a maintaining of the status quo of the present situation. But we don't know. We don't know. If we would want to get a real prediction here, we should not only measure the actual differences and the tendencies that we get in them, but we should also be able to measure the attitudes, or at least to get a better idea of what the attitudes are, for instance, from the point of view of this classification of attitudes. And that's not something that I can offer to you at this point, but I'm sure that many of you will have ideas on how to do that, and I'll be happy to learn about them. Thank you.